Welcome to Display Case. I'm Bren. This is Dan Z, and we're from the American Museum of Fly Fishing. Thanks for tuning into our first episode of Display Case. This is something that Dan and I have wanted to do for a while now. So, Dan, let's start with a bit about why we're doing this.
Yeah, I think at the core of it, we're just really trying to prove that people under 35 not only appreciate fly fishing history, but are interested and hungry for it. My exposure to the museum has opened up way too many questions, and sitting down with you and other museum folks, it's just a chance to explore this sport. And I believe that our world is full of stories. Fishing stories are at the core of what fishing is. And we kind of want to be that bridge between those museum shelves in Manchester and Springfield, Missouri, and just kind of focus on what's interesting and compelling.
Yep,
So
right on.
pretty much once a month we're going to get on here and use this show to talk about what we're doing across the sport, events coming up, interesting people that we've met along the way, and tell fishing stories.
For me, the kind of higher level answer to that question is that, we want to prove a couple things. And I think they're both related to the fact that just because we're a physical museum, with locations in Manchester, Vermont, and Springfield, Missouri, that doesn't mean that, one, we're not constantly doing things outside the four walls, of our exhibits and our buildings all over the country. And two, just because our museums are located in those areas doesn't mean that we focus on any one particular fishery or area. So like you said, Dan, each month we want to use this show to highlight everything we're doing really across the entire spectrum of fly fishing sport and culture, both near and far.
Yeah, and I think the third thing for me too is kind of building a community. We digitally are able to touch people on social and our emails, but not necessarily conversationally and across the board and across the country. So I think really, unless you're like me or Jim, where we're super interested in collecting gear, or somebody who just picked up a 5-weight and wants to understand why it's called that and what their rod is, kind of just want to feel like you're pulled up a chair into the museum and sat down and kind of listened to what's going on and what makes us excited.
Right. So we've got lots of ideas where we can take this. I think, Dan, you just teed up a bunch of them. But this first episode is going to mostly focus on our recent Road Trip Raffle. And in fact, we're going to announce the winner here in a few minutes. So stay tuned to see if you won. We're going to announce it live. But on the subject of the Road Trip Raffle, Dan, let's talk a bit about the rivers that our winner is going to get to fish. Obviously, a big part of the reason that AMFF got started here in Manchester was due to the bat and kill and its prominent role in early American fly fishing. So that was an obvious one. But collectively, there's even more history spread across New York and PA. Obviously, the Ausables up in the Adirondacks. The beaver kill is more in the Catskill, Pennsylvania region. And that is one of your home waters. So let's talk a bit about the Delaware, of which the beaver kill is a tributary, and kind of when we were going through this process of picking where the winner was going to go, why you felt like the beaver kill was just an absolute must in terms of being a stop on this road trip.
Yeah, I think for anyone who's aware of East Coast fishing, you hear about the legendary Catskills dry flies. And starting up in the headwaters of the Willowemoc down to the beaver kill, down to the East Branch, and then down to the Delaware. You're from where the Delaware meets the sea all the way up to where the East and the West come together. It's 450 miles. It's actually the longest undammed river in the East Coast. And what happens with that is you get this incredible, intact fishery that operates relatively as it should. And, not only in terms of natural history, you have that piece. But in terms of angling history, you had people coming up in the Victorian times on the trains up from New York. The Catskills was one of the first places that you could reach
Yeah.
in a day trip and have a weekend and then get back home to the city. Um, and so what resulted is a lot of trial and error on the river, a lot of innovation, a lot of competition. And so you just end up with a place that when you're fishing it, you feel like you're in the company of people who came before you.
Yeah.
And like every hole you're standing there and you're like, okay, cool. Somebody stood here in 1850 and thought about the same thing that I'm thinking about, which is like, what fly am I going to throw at that riser in the head of the pool? And so I think to me, that kind of that's like the southern border of the Catskills, and every every fish that swims through there swims through the Delaware. And I think it's just like a really important piece of Eastern fly fishing. And, they don't call the Catskills the birthplace of American fly fishing for nothing.
Yeah, 100%. So kind of on the subject of what you're saying, the subject of people and amazing people and being in the same shoes as some of those early legends, the winner of this raffle is going to get a day in the water with 3 amazing handpicked guides. And we caught up with a couple of them earlier this month. We had a chat. One of those is Rachel Finn. If you're not familiar, Rachel is the lead guide at the Hungry Trout in Wilmington, New York, on the Sable. She was also a featured star of a film that we did in partnership with Fly Lords called After You've Gone. So check that out if you're interested. In any case, Rachel's an ambassador for us, and we always have fun catching up. And one of the things we thought would be fun is to ask her where she'd want to go on a fly fishing road trip. Obviously, she loves guiding in her home waters, but we were keen to know, where she'd go if she had the chance. And here's what she said.
I love just exploring new water and off the beaten track stuff. So one place where I've never been is the North Carolina, the Appalachians, and that whole area has a lot of cool brook trout fishing. I love that. I'd love to go to the driftless area. I have some friends up there. That just sounds like a really weird place, geologically, strange kind of no glaciers there. It just made all this cool water. I love, of course, the ultimate road trip would be trout bum your way through British Columbia for steelhead, but that's a dream unto itself. But I'm not tapped out on the United States. Yeah, I'd love to do. I was in Italy in the fall for a family vacation with my family. We lived there when I was 10 years old in Florence, and I know there's some great trout fishing in Tuscany. I'd love to do that. Just kind of, stay out in Tuscany and find some little, not trophy hunting or anything. I'm over that part of my life. I just love, really, but I love the intimate. I love intimate streams. That's one thing I really sort of learned about myself later in life.
All right. So Dan, which of those few places that Rachel talked about do you second? Or if not, where are you going instead?
I mean, I think for me, if you want to talk about a legendary, once in a lifetime road trip, it's driving the Pan American Highway all the way down there. Now, while it's probably not possible in my lifetime to drive 3 months down through Central and South America, I think I want to end up right up on the banks of the Lemay. It feels like Montana, big sky, huge browns, plenty of wind that makes you earn every fish. You got to have your cast dialed. And there's just there's something about traveling that far, but then there's also just something about teleporting in February to summer somewhere else, because Rachel can tell you too that after this winter, February in upstate New York, it can get pretty snowy and you can get, a decent amount of cabin fever. So I think getting to connect with summertime hopper fishing in a big river that's as famous as the Big Hole, I think that ticks every box for me.
Yeah, that'd be sweet. I think I kind of second her take on North Carolina. Sort of, I always imagine it'd be fun to do kind of like the Albie Harkers thing, and then also go chase mountain brook trout. Could be a really fun combo type road trip, which would be awesome. Um,
And that reminds me of like a trip that I took in college. We had spring break. We woke up at 2 o'clock in the morning after our last class, drove from Pittsburgh all the way down to northern Georgia, and then fished our way all the way back north across the whole week. And I mean, that's just, talk about core memories. And I couple memorable fish, but even more so is just like the time spent on the water with friends and the time in the car
yeah,
and
100%.
just those minutes you never get back.
All right, so back to the Ausable. We also talked to Rachel about the history of that fishery. Obviously, given its status, so many legends fished up there. Of course, it's been studied in the museums. We've produced a lot of content around it. And so we were talking to Rachel about, maybe some things that people misunderstand. And one of the things she mentioned was that, back in the day, a lot of those legends were way more likely to fish the East Branch of the Ausable, which today certainly, isn't the case or doesn't have that reputation. And Rachel talked about how there's a lot of good stuff going on to try to fix that, but in any case, eventually Rachel kind of shared a great story about how she was fishing the main stem of the Ausable more recently. And I think her point really was that, you can have a very remote experience on the Ausable. And maybe the bigger points like the magic of a fishery doesn't always have to be nonstop hookups, while that's nice. And so let's roll the tape of Rachel telling that story. It's a great one.
The main stem of the Ausable is not fished hard at all, and it does get very warm. It can, I don't even want to tell you how warm it gets. But a couple of years ago, so I there's that one spot, and then I started just exploring near there, and I found this other spot. And I drove into this little. It wasn't far from the road at all, but I don't know. I just looked across. There was like a couple of rocks on the other side. It wasn't like a huge pool. You're like, oh my God, look at that pool. It's unbelievable. It's just kind of, that looks fishy, and I don't know if I maybe caught one fish there, but I didn't get there every year. Like, I have these, I don't know about you, but I have these spots like, oh, I got to check that out. So every couple of years I'd go there, nothing. Or it was one of those places that reminded me of the West Branch of the Delaware where you're wading up to here, and you're on your tippy toes because you can't reach it, and it was just always this little deep spot. So it was probably 3 years ago. It was in May. Was March Browns, and I had to go to Plattsburgh, New York, which is the biggest town near us, to go to the dentist or something. And I'm coming home. It was like 11 o'clock in the morning. It was, it's maybe in the 60s, sunny day. And I said, I'm going to check out this. I had my fishing stuff with me. And I went and I go to the spot and I actually see a fish rising in this spot. Like, and just the hardest spot you've ever seen to get behind a rock, and I was like, I could barely reach it with a dry fly. Terrible, drift, not even a drift, brutal. And I was like, oh man, it wasn't necessarily rising a lot. So then I was like, well, what the hell? I'm going to throw in a woolly bugger. That extra weight of the fly will help me get a little bit of distance, and dude, I threw the first cast that I threw in there. I caught a 22.5-inch brown. That, to me, I'm not a biologist, but I believe this fish to be wild. This was probably one of the nicest fish I've ever caught on the Ausable in 30 years, and it was just like, it made me believe, it was like Ted Lasso, it was really incredible. Not saying you should go fish that spot. I probably would never catch another fish there. But then, I'm all about that now. Like, I'm not a numbers person. I never was. But, I went back to that spot and I just sat there one night. And I don't even think I ever made a cast, So, stuff like that I love. And I love some of the smaller water that I've discovered has had some pretty great surprises that you wouldn't believe. But the Ausable, I would say, it's not as crowded as you think it is, or it's not as easy to figure out as you think it is. If you want to explore and have that kind of sense of discovery, it's very possible to have here. Very possible to have a very remote day there. Most people wouldn't think that,
Yeah, I mean, I think I really identify with the slower pace of dry fly season. It forces you, especially in the East when the trout are a little more educated. It forces you to kind of to breathe. You have to rest the fish if you don't. if they don't come up for the dry the right way the first time, or if you miss a set. And it kind of forced you to be excessively present in that moment, but also just like breathing, looking up at the bald eagle coming down the river, like the mergansers going around. I think you come to terms with where you are in nature a bit more when you're dry fly fishing, and especially if you're using a slower rod, longer leader. Everything has to come together in the right moment, and everything is dependent on patience.
Okay, so we've also chatted with Brew Muscarello a few weeks back, and Brew's going to be the guide on the Bat and Kill portion of the road trip. And so we took a bit of that conversation, actually used it to promote the raffle as a social clip. We overlaid a bit where he's talking about what makes the Bat and Kill super special. So maybe folks out there saw that on social. But I want to bring it up again, and I'm excited to get your take on this, Dan. Bit about Brew. Brew owns Trico Unlimited Guide Service, right here in Arlington. He was a 2024 Orvis Guide of the Year finalist, which is, an amazing honor. And certainly it's hard to think anyone better to guide the winner on the museum's home waters. But in any case, we ran this clip. We're going to play it again. And it generated a ton of cool reactions. And then Dan, I'm curious to get your take on it. So let's roll that clip of Brew.
The thing about the bat and killers is that they're all wild fish. Whether you're fishing for the wild brookies and upstream or some of the bigger browns, they're all wild. It's challenging, and you'll be tested. Some of the fish might come easier in different rivers. Not to say it's easier on the Delaware or anything like that, but it's definitely a challenging river on the Bat and Kill, and that's one of the things I like most about it.
All right, so the reason he mentions the Delaware in that clip is that we were previously talking about how really all these rivers present different challenges and opportunities. But I'm curious to get your reaction, Dan. What kinds of unique challenges do you think the Del presents?
On the Delaware, it's not to me about numbers per se. It's about finding the right fish, and especially in dry fly season, like feeding that one fish. There's so many days that just feels like you're having a conversation with that animal. What it wants to eat, what type of cast it wants to look at. They'll come right back up after you miss a hook set, and they'll remind you that it's their river and you're just floating on it, as opposed to whatever else we sometimes call it, giving you the fin. And I think the Bat and Kill probably has a little bit lighter pressure in the summertime from anglers, but the beauty of the Delaware is, like I said, you have hundreds of miles of productive trout water from the east and the west branch and the main stem. So you can kind of choose what you want to look at, whether you want to look at the smaller river up in the east branch and before the beaver kill joins and have a more intimate session, or you can take a drift boat down the main stem on thousands of CFS of water floating in pools that are 30 feet deep with fish that are only sitting 3 inches under the surface.
So we did not get a chance to chat with John from Catskill Guide Service, but we did see John at the Edison Fly Fishing Show. And again, we're so thankful to John as well, and really all the guides, for agreeing to participate in the raffle and giving their time. And more than anything, we're thankful for everyone out there who bought tickets, right? So we're the only ones really in the world doing what we do, and the only way we can keep doing it is with your support. So again, thank you to everybody that entered. I think, Dan, let's announce this winner, and hopefully everyone out there, get excited. Hopefully you win, but again, if not, thanks for being part of something that was really successful and is just helping us with our mission so much. So Dan, you do the honors.
Our winner, insert drum roll, is going to be Michael from Oak Ridge, New Jersey. Congrats, dude. You're going to be driving up along some of my favorite rivers, and the dream season to be on them. I hope the front of your car is plastered with plenty of mayflies. There's nothing quite like driving along a river after a good day of fishing and seeing what's hatching based on what's on your hood. Yeah, I will be in touch with for dates and details. yeah, if you want to watch the official drawing, go check it out on our socials. That's at Fly Fish Museum on Instagram and American Museum of Fly Fishing on Facebook.
Yeah, right on. Amazing. Congrats, Michael. And thank you again for everyone who entered. Again, we so appreciate the support. Let's transition to another exciting announcement. And I think there's, in some ways it's related, but that is the launch of our Top 50 Countdown in partnership with MidCurrent. So starting this month, we're counting down over the course of 2025, the 50 most interesting objects in AMFF's permanent collection, which currently sits around 25,000 plus objects. And that's even a little conservative.
Wow.
Yeah, truly. So, and you can imagine how much work goes into maintaining that and just preserving everything in there and enriching what we do have, learning more about it, etc. So we just posted the first installment this month on MidCurrent. It's up live now, and it's objects 50 through 36, so the first 15. And we'll make sure to include that link in the video description below. And so, Dan, you know, when you saw that just go live for the first time, what stood out to you the most in those first 15 objects?
I mean, I think it's crazy how much that like relates to what we've just been talking about. You can't fish those rivers that we just spoke about without the name Wolf or Schweibert coming up. In fact, you can't really say Beaverkill or Willow Weemock without immediately thinking of Lee and Joan. And you know, it's kind of like flipping through this like personal journal of American fly fishing. Behind like every new piece is just something that's another question, right? I mean, you say 25,000 objects, I say I have 25,000 questions.
Yeah.
And I was just really surprised by some of the lesser known gear, some of these like really quirky, like personal things that we have. It's just incredible to see like how far fly fishing has evolved. You know, maybe insight into why your buddy likes to fish that vintage reel. And you know, it's not just this like old piece of aluminum, it's a piece of history and something that's fished on these rivers.
Yeah, I mean that it's a great point, Dan, just in terms of how much linkage there is between that list and what we just talked about. And it is making me think it's probably worth mentioning that if you subscribe to AMFF's newsletter, we included a bunch of links to museum content related to those rivers, the Battenkill, the Beaverkill, and the Ausable, in our final raffle reminder email. So check that out. Go back and look at that if you want to learn even more about some of these rivers. And if you don't get our emails, you can visit amff.org and sign up there. But in any case, back to the top 50. You know, we did also recently sit down with Phil Monahan. He's the editor-in-chief at MidCurrent, right after we launched the first installment. And so let's roll a clip of Phil talking about why he and his team were so excited to launch this partnership alongside us.
I think that fly fishers in general are really attracted to the sport because it has this really long and powerful history. And most people have some sense of American fly fishing history, but the details are actually missing from their knowledge base. And so one of the things that I've always found so cool about the American Museum of Fly Fishing is you get to actually put dates and names and faces and products into perspective in this wider sweep of American fly fishing history. You know, someone who took up the sport even 30 years ago after A River Runs Through It came out, still might not know that people were doing this in the US hundreds of years ago. You know, people were always amazed when I worked for Orvis that Orvis had been in business since 1856. I mean, that was astonishing to them. So one of the reasons that I love the museum collection is just that it gives it puts meat on the bone when you're thinking about American fly fishing history. And the fact that we're able to sort of give people multiple exposures to this stuff, I think will really pique their interest even more to find out. But you know, what are the cool things about American fly fishing history that I don't know? And, you know, hopefully that gets them excited about the museum collection itself and about just exploring what I think is a incredibly fascinating history.
So to keep things interesting, Phil does not know what the rest of the list looks like. In fact, only a few people do. But Phil has been in and around the museum for a number of years. He mentioned that he used to work for Orvis for a long time. So we thought it'd be fun to ask him if he felt like there's anything that comes to mind that was definitely going to make the list at some point later in the year. Let's roll the tape.
Well, one of the things I think is a slam dunk to make the list is Lefty Kray's first Fluger medalist reel that Joe Brooks gave him, which Lefty modified. It didn't give him enough drag, so he actually cut out a piece of the frame so he could put his thumb against the spool. And what I love about that is I'm of a certain age, but it sort of connects a farther past to the past that I knew. I met Lefty. I knew him a little bit. So to see this object that was the genesis of the entire career of Lefty Kray, by far the most famous American fly fisherman, I think is super cool.
All right, Dan, I think that's all we've got for this first episode. What's coming up next month?
So next month, May, that's my favorite, I think, month of the year. We're going to be diving into more of our fly rankings, super apt with the beginning of dry fly season kicking off across the country. We're going to recap our heritage event that's coming up on May 1st, honoring Oliver White. And then Brent and I are going to be talking a little bit about our cheeky fly fishing tournament strategy on the Cape. And there's so much to talk about in May in the fishing world that I don't think we're gonna have any problems.
I think you're right there. Awesome. All right, so everyone, stay tuned for that. If you made it this far, you should probably just subscribe to the channel, and that way you'll know as soon as the next episode drops. Thanks again for joining us today on Display Case, and we will see you next month.